All right, thank you. I'm going to call the meeting, the July 15, 2020 meeting of the Holland City Council to order. Before we do the roll call, I want to just reiterate something that we have said periodically since March, and that is this council has determined that it's very important for us to be able to meet in person. There are other bodies and actually other committees within the city that have been meeting through Zoom meetings. But we have worked very hard and diligently to be able to continue to meet in person. And in order to do that, we have set ourselves up so that we have appropriate social distancing. We have social distancing for the folks that are here, and we are all wearing masks as well. And I want to thank the members of the audience for doing that as well. We do have speakers set up outside for some folks, although I've heard that there may be a storm that's coming. So we'll do our best to make accommodations for folks this evening, because we know that there are a number of people that might want to participate. But I do thank you all for doing your best to be able to try to keep us all safe and healthy in this process so that we can continue to have these meetings in person, because I think personally, I think that's very valuable. Kathy, would you please call the roll?
Byrd.
Present.
Peters. Here. Garcia.
Here.
Trethewey.
Here.
Arnshorst. Here. Corbin. Here. Hoekstra.
Here.
Raymond.
Here.
Mayor Box.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We're going to begin the meeting this evening, as we do traditionally, with an opening prayer, today by Councilman Mike Trethewey, who has been providing a lot of prayers for us lately, and thank you, Mike. We appreciate that. Your name keeps coming up, I think, in the drawing that they're doing upstairs, but we appreciate that. I think it's your skill that's doing that rather than randomness that's there. Yeah. And immediately following the prayer, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance, so we'd ask that you would join us if you will.
If you're so inclined, please pray with me. Our Heavenly Father, we continue to be in awe of the ultimate beautiful splendor that you give us in this city. The lifestyles, the friendships, the people that live here. Although we may not all agree on every issue, we have a common theme. We just have to realize it sometimes. That common theme is where we live, called the City of Holland. Lord, we especially ask that you be with those that are troubled, those that are ill, those that are affected by the COVID, those that are a little bit on the edge, trying to find their way through all this uncertainty that we have. Lord, I ask that you be with us this evening, that we keep our wits about us, that we keep civil tongues, that we understand and appreciate what every person is asking and speaking. Keep an open heart and an open mind, and ultimately, decisions that come down will be for your good, to your good, and by your good. Lord, we especially ask that you be with those that protect us, both near and far. Be with all city employees during their daily tasks for the betterment of the city and the betterment of the citizens of the City of Holland. Lord, we pray this all in your name. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next are our consent agenda items. These are items that are considered to be fairly routine, and they will all be enacted with one motion, unless a member of the public or a council member requests that the item be taken from the consent agenda and put in its regular place on the regular agenda. Kathy, would you please review the consent agenda for us?
4B, approval of minutes, July 1, 2020 regular meeting and July 8, 2020 study session. 4C, oaths of office. 4D, Board of Public Works, resolution authorizing transfer of funds for contribution to the city fiscal year 2021. Board of Public Works, poll attachment agreement contract approval. 4F, Board of Public Works Retiree Health Insurance Subsidy Corrective Action Plan. 4G, City Clerk, claims filed against the city. 4H, City Clerk, Annual License Renewal 2020-2021. 4I, Finance, Approved Contract for DDA Services with Smart Zone. 4J, Purchasing, Award Bid for Tulips. 4K, Downtown Development Authority Board Appointment. 4L, Approval of Easement with Consumers Energy for the Dog Park at Van Raalte Farm. 4M, Revocable License Agreement, Projecting Sign, 3 West 8th Street.
Thank you very much. Is there any member of the public that would like to have an item removed from the consent agenda and placed on the regular agenda? Does a member of council wish to remove an item from the consent agenda and place it upon the regular agenda? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to accept the agenda as presented.
Moved by Trethewey. Is there support?
Support.
Support by Byrd. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next item is public comment. We provide a public comment period at every single meeting that we hold, every public meeting that we hold here at the City of Holland. When we're dealing with public comment at a regular city council meeting, we ask that during this general public comment period that you come and speak only about items that are not otherwise on the agenda. And so I know that we have at least 1 or 2 items on the agenda that I would estimate that some of the folks here are here to speak about. We would ask that you hold those comments until we reach those particular items on the agenda. If you are going to come up and make a public comment about another item, during our regular meetings, we limit that to 5 minutes. You can see there are 3 lights in front of me on the dais. There's a green light, a yellow light, and a red light. If the light is green, that means you are doing very well on time. If it's yellow, you have 1 minute or less left. And when the light turns red, your time has expired, and we are very strict about that. And we ask that you abide by that as well. Having said that, is there, Ellen, I'm going to add one little item that I know Mr. Trethewey is going to say, and I always forget to say it because we've not had an issue with it yet during my tenure, but that we do ask that there not be any reaction from the audience in regard to public comment. Folks have been wonderful, even very, very respectful, not even respectful, very, very respectful of everyone that's spoken, and we expect that that will continue through this process as well. So having said that, is there anyone here who would like to speak to council about an item that is not otherwise on the agenda this evening? Seeing none, I will close that public comment period. Also, a little farther down the line, we are going to be dealing with, we have a public comment at City of Holland email address. We have received a number of those public comments, and we'll be accepting those into the record a little farther down the agenda. And there was a cutoff period late this afternoon, so if you did send an email later in the afternoon, it may not have made it into that group because we did have to cut that off at some point, and I know that it was at some point after 3 o'clock this afternoon because some of them had a 3 o'clock timestamp on them. But we'll get to those in a few moments down the line. Next item is item number 7, special order of the day, public hearings, Finance Department, Industrial Development District at 4416 52nd Street. Mr. Van Beek.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Council. The Industrial Development District process is something that probably doesn't come that often before Council because districts are required to be created in this instance before you can adopt what you're more familiar with, which is the Industrial Facilities Tax Exemption, or the PA 198. This evening, there is a request to adopt or to create such a district for property located at 4416 52nd Street. And this is down new section of the city where Interchange Drive was constructed in the not so distant past. And there's a company that is looking to construct a warehousing, a 275,000 square foot facility there. So They asked, and we suggested in the COVID environment that it was not necessary that they be here this evening. Hopefully that's okay. But that this step would just create the district, and then before really anything substantively changed, then they would submit a 198 IFT tax abatement request with more information. So should you approve this district this evening, then in the future you can expect to see a 198 request. I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Any questions from council? All right. We do need to have a public hearing in this regard, so at this point, I will open the public hearing in regard to this particular item. Is there anyone here who would like to speak in regard to this particular item? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. What is the pleasure of council in regard to this item?
Move we adopt the resolution?
Moved by Hoekstra. Is there support?
Support.
Support by Aaronsource. Any discussion? Kathy, could you please call the roll?
Byrd.
Yes.
Peters. Garcia.
Yes.
Trethewey.
Yes.
Arnshorst.
Yes.
Corbin. Hoekstra.
Yes.
Raymond.
Yes.
Mayor Box.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. We're on to item number 9, written petitions and communications. As I said earlier, we have, in this age of COVID, set up a special email address, public comment, and that's singular comment because we did receive one that came with an S on the end of it that bounced back. So I just want to make sure people understand it's public comment singular at cityofholland.com. And over the course of the last 2 weeks, we received, I believe, my number's on the other side, 30 of them through last week and an additional 50 through approximately 3 o'clock this afternoon. Those have all been received by council. But at this point, I would entertain a motion to accept those into the record. Moved by Byrd. Is there support?
Support.
Support by Trethewey. Any discussion? And I think we do this with a roll call vote. Or excuse me, with a voice vote? Yeah. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. I believe the next item is item 12C1, policy option for city council to consider regarding a proposed protection against discrimination as requested by city council. And before I pass this on to the city manager for the staff report, there's a lot going on with a couple of different items that are very much related to one another. And I wanted to explain and refresh both for council and make sure that we have the chief governance officer speaking on this as well. But I want to do a little refresher on Robert's Rules of Order and the process, and in terms of how all of this works. We've got 2 different items. We've got item number 1 and number 2 that are very similar to one another. There was some discussion about whether they were mutually exclusive or not. There was some thought about the fact that if you could do one or the other or neither, but both wouldn't necessarily work. But there has been some discussion of that might be a possibility if council chose to do that by amending some language. But I did want to make sure that everyone understood that in regard to the policy, item number 1, it would take 1 vote from this body, and if we voted this evening to adopt the policy, that policy then would go into effect. If we chose to go the ordinance route, the vote that we make tonight only moves the process forward. And if you have read the entire agenda, you'll see that later in the agenda, there is an item labeled first reading of ordinances. So by voting in this item number 12, it would then merely move us to item number 14, where we would then vote again to accept it into first reading. The ordinance would still not be in effect at that point. We are required to vote on it at 2 separate meetings. We would move it into first reading. We would then, as a council, discuss it, make amendments, make changes, and then at a future meeting, would then have the final vote on whether there was an ordinance or not, but it would take those multiple votes. So I just want to make sure everybody understood how that process would work through this. Now, with each of the individual items, I am going to ask the staff to make a report on the item. Once the staff is completed with that report, we will need a motion from council in order to be able to make a decision or be able to move the discussion forward. We do not do discussion until we have a motion. At the time that the motion is made, we will then give the members of the public the opportunity to speak in regard to that particular item. Once we are done with the public comment period, then the council will discuss the motion as it is, make amendments, make changes, and ultimately vote then on the motion that has been made. So, having said all of that, Mr. Van Beek, staff report, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Council. I don't think you're going to find any surprises here with the presentations that we make to you this evening. First up is the policy option for Council to consider regarding proposed protections against discrimination as requested by Council. The document that you have before you is exactly the document that you had last week. It is in response to your request for the city manager and really Ron as the city attorney doing the majority of the work here, thank you, Ron, in doing some research and then preparing these various options for you. Largely, the language is very similar. There's a few more sections in the ordinance than there are in the policy. But again, before you at this point in the agenda is the policy option to protect against discrimination. And I'm not sure if Ron has anything else he'd like to add at this point. Certainly this would be a good time to do so. Otherwise, we obviously can answer questions of mayor and council as you see fit.
Yeah, we described it pretty much in detail last week, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Both the policy and the ordinance would make an affirmative statement prohibiting discrimination in the city. The ordinance, as we described, it has the force of law. It's binding. The policy is a statement of principles. And so I'd be glad to answer any questions about it.
Does council have any questions in regard to this particular item before someone presents a motion, or is somebody interested in presenting a motion in regard to the policy?
Let's get the ball rolling. Make a motion to adopt the policy and present it to us.
It's not yet time for comment. There will be time for comment. Once the motion is on the floor, then the public has the ability to comment. Continue, please, Mr. Trethewey.
Good. Adopt the policy as written.
All right, thank you. It's been moved by Trethewey. Is there support?
Support.
Support by Byrd. Now, having said that, now we will open this for public comment. Is there anyone here who would like to speak in regard to the policy portion of this? Now, having said that, there are multiple items on the agenda this evening that deal with a similar issue. If you may certainly come up 3 times if that comes up that many times to speak. However, if you do have the same thing to say, we as a council, I think I can speak for all of us, have the ability to remember what it was that you said from one item on the agenda to the next item on the agenda. So it's, from our perspective, it's not necessary for you to come up multiple times in regard to the same issue if you're going to be saying the same thing. But that is your right if you choose to do that. We're just asking you, please remember that we're human beings up here as well. And remember, time limit is 5 minutes. This is one-way communication. You are speaking to us. We will not be answering questions to you at this point or communicating with you at this point. This is your opportunity to speak to us. Now, having said that, is there anyone here who would like to address council in regard to this matter? And please state your name and address for the record.
Sure. Jennifer Adams. I work at Grace Episcopal Church, 555 Michigan Avenue, and I'm chair of the board at Out on the Lake Shore, 536 Lincoln. I want to thank you again for the thoroughness in approaching this, for your willingness to continue to listen as you go. I want to speak directly to some of the questions raised last week with regard to policy and ordinance. First, to those of you thinking council is acting too quickly, 9 years really isn't jumping the gun. This might feel quick to those who haven't lived with the consequences of no ordinance, but truth is this whole community has carried the weight of leaving this work undone and allowing it to divide us for too long. For perspective, the young man who stood up last week, a lifelong resident, soccer player, and now Hope student, was about 10 years old when council refused to take this step. This conversation has already taken half of his life and a big hunk of all of ours. Let go of the concern that moving toward an ordinance is being done with haste. I also want to respectfully challenge the statement that the process is the same with either the policy or the ordinance, because it isn't. On the state level, yes, but not on the ground. A policy contains no obligation to follow through, and therefore would require city staff to decide on whether or not to even engage it every time. An ordinance simplifies that, eliminates that step by obligating them to. Several of you have said you hate discrimination in any form. A policy repeats those words. An ordinance commits the city to act on them. Now, I'm profoundly aware of the faith that many of you hold and the internal and external wrestling that you've done with this. Thank you for your willingness to wrestle. I want to go a little biblical on you tonight in response to scripture shared last week. Now, I don't actually think that batting verses back and forth is God's intent for how we handle this gift of sacred text, but it's important to note that there are Christians, members of the community of faith, who very strongly support an ordinance versus a policy. An ordinance will come, as it says in Matthew, as a cup of cold water to those who thirst, an opening of the hearts, the offering of basic and necessary protections to the least of these, my brothers and sisters. This is an acknowledgement that we are all created in God's image, a step resonating with the prophet Isaiah's vision of a peaceable kingdom, and a heeding of Micah's call to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God and others too. I could go on, but most fundamentally, this is what loving your neighbor looks like as we all go about the very conservative endeavors of securing employment and making our homes here. All that while an ordinance will exempt religious institutions. Section 25(9)(a) of this proposed ordinance explicitly states freedom of religion, protections under the First Amendment remain intact. Therefore, to answer last week's question, yes, churches are exempt. You have lots of power, council, but changing the First Amendment is not one of them. Finally, I was here 9 years ago. I was sitting right there. There were hundreds of people in this room, over 85% of whom spoke in favor. And as several of you have said, the pain of that night was profound, and it has continued to have an impact. The pain wasn't only due to the vote itself, but to the incredibly disorienting way in which it went down. Just a few months later, the city gave Holland is Ready the Social Justice Award for doing justice work that the city itself did not support. The messages sent in the directions of those who, for many reasons, find themselves on the margins of this community are, to put it mildly, mixed. And endorsing a policy instead of an ordinance would continue that hurtful pattern. A policy would say that Holland values all of its citizens while refusing a commitment to actions that would show that the city means it. If there is a plus to this long process, and I do think there are many, it is that the ordinance now encompasses a broad range of people who are wanting to call Holland home. It is comprehensive and it is solid. Thank you, City Manager and City Attorney, for your work, and to all those who have worked and wrestled our way forward to now. Here's your moment, Council. Make we get to live here that much more closer to true for us all. Something a policy won't quite be able to do, but an ordinance will. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Van Beek, for wiping down the podium in between each one of our speakers. Takes a little extra time, but has a whole lot of value.
and other duties as assigned.
That's why we put that little phrase in your contract. Is there anyone else here who would like to address council? And please state your name and address for the record.
Jill DeYoung, 684 South 160th Avenue, Holland, 49423. I grew up in Holland, enjoying the beach in the summer and playing with neighborhood kids until dusk. In high school, I played tennis and was a varsity debater. I graduated as a top scholar. I went to a Christian college. I played volleyball and worked in the library. My friends and I liked to sing karaoke at Applebee's. I graduated with degrees in cross-cultural ministries and Bible theology. My most favorite place on earth is Haiti, where I volunteered for several months in an orphanage. I work in an adult foster care facility. I coach middle school girls volleyball. I attend a church that I can call my family. I'm a firstborn. I adore being an aunt. My best friend and I feed ducks every Monday. My favorite animal is the flamingo. I watch way too much Grey's Anatomy. I enjoy dandelions in the late spring, the feeling of the perfectly smooth pen gliding across paper, and the satisfaction of carrying all of my groceries inside with one trip. I've experienced soul-shattering sorrows. I've lost friends and family to cancer, car accidents, and suicide. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse and rape. And I fight the demons of depression and anxiety every day. I feel afraid of getting lost when my phone is dead, of being alone when my mind is dark, and of losing the things that are most precious to me. And I've known the joy that comes from capturing the perfect photograph, from tiny arms wrapping me in big hugs, hammocking after a long hike, and friends who drop off homemade food and fresh cut flowers. Now maybe you think that I've just spent too much time introducing myself to you. But these are things that I've done on purpose, in the hopes that you could start to see me as a human being. Perhaps even a human being that you have a thing or two in common with. As I was preparing my remarks, it occurred to me that I was doing exactly what I've been told to do if ever I am kidnapped. Talk about my life, establish common ground, connect you to my humanity, because that is what's going to increase my odds of survival. What I didn't tell you initially is that I am also a lesbian. For many of us in the LGBTQIA community, to come out and be fully known feels like we're in the middle of a dangerous game of survival. And that's because for many of us, we are. Now, I want to be sensitive to all. Though it hurts me deeply, I can allow the space and room for other people to believe that the way I live and love is wrong, or gross, or sinful. Those are feelings and beliefs that you are allowed to choose for yourself. But what should not be allowed is the ability and permission to treat me as inhuman. A society that doesn't blanket its people in the most basic fundamentals is depraved beyond comprehension. We are not asking for anything more than what everyone should have: a place to live and a place to work. These are things that often determine success or failure in life: mental health or mental illness, physical well-being or physical deterioration, and yes, even life or death. When they are denied to someone because of their color, age, gender identity, or sexual orientation, we lose sight of the thing that matters most to all of us: loving our neighbor. A policy is not enough. It's a Barbie Band-Aid on an open wound. It looks nice, but it isn't healing anything. It says my life is still just an option. We need an ordinance, because that says that my life and the life of my friends and neighbors matter and has value. Not because we all agree, but because we're all human. I shouldn't need to convince anyone of my humanity or how housing and employment should be rights available to us all. I shouldn't feel like I'm negotiating my own hostage situation, because we all should get to live here, and because I would much rather introduce myself over coffee and donuts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Is there anyone else who would like to address council? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
Hi, my name is Lexi Scott, and my address is 453 Evergreen Lane, Holland, Michigan, 49424. But I work in Holland out of 746 East 16th Street, Meyer. This is my wife, Chelsea Scott. I offered to bring her with me because she makes me look a little bit more presentable and a little bit more muted, kind of colorful. One of the things I wanted to talk to you today is about what makes me a member of the community. Some of the things that make me a good member of the community is the fact that I'm friendly. I help some of my elderly neighbors with carrying their groceries in, as well as my customers. I always have treats for my customers and for their puppies and children. I pay my taxes. I often help out some of our local friends without homes with a ride, some food, or just a smile and conversation. I keep a watch out for other people's safety and well-being. I smile at people passing by and say hi. In conversation with visitors or tourists, I always recommend my favorite local establishments as to support our local economy. I do my best to live up to Holland's most visible value, welcome. I also like to point out that I wear a mask and wash my hands, and I even go to church. It kind of seems like an expectation around here. What makes me a less good member of the community? I sometimes speed. I inherited a lead foot from my mom. I can often be found jamming out to loud music in my car wherever I go. I have, on occasion, forgotten to pick up my dog's poop when we're on walks. I might be overly chatty. And I'm probably guilty of littering and probably loitering a little bit too. Reasons that the city of Holland currently thinks that I shouldn't be protected under ordinance. Have you ever heard that phrase, fat and happy? That's me. I'm overweight, I'm gay. I'm married to a woman, a very talented, wonderful woman. I don't have any children. Apparently that is also an expectation around here. I have short hair, and I look like a dude. Sometimes I get called sir, in fact, often. And I have horrible ADHD. As it stands, according to the current policy, if I want to live in the city of Holland and be protected under ordinance, I have some serious changes to make. Or you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. And Chelsea. Is there anyone else that would like to address council? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
I'm Reverend Gordon Wiersma. I live at 257 West 11th Street, and I serve Hope Church, which is right across the street here. I wish I could wear my glasses to see you better, but they get fogged up. It's one of the issues here. And I can't read my notes either, so we'll see how this goes. I want to say that I ask you to vote against this idea of a policy no matter what. And what I mean is that if you don't pass an ordinance this evening, which I strongly encourage you as the wise thing to do, that having a policy would be worse. I haven't vetted this with all my colleagues, but it strikes me as something that would be both a wink and a nod to our community that this doesn't really matter. And even worse, it would be another diminishment to people in our community, neighbors, the LGBTQ plus community, that this whole process has meant to give a new acknowledgement in our community. I serve Hope Church, which some of you may know in our community. Some people do, as a church that is seen as more progressive in a more conservative denomination, the Reformed Church. You've received an email from one of my leaders, and I'll reiterate what she said, that even in a conservative denomination like the Reformed Church, they made a statement to Council 9 years ago supporting this ordinance, and way back to the 1970s, even in the midst of theological disagreement, the Reformed Church has always said that civil rights should be protected by law for all people, including, it says in our statements, those who are gay, LGBTQ plus people. So that sets an important bar that even for my more conservative colleagues I can speak, but that's too low a bar because it only speaks to preventing people. But an ordinance also allows for creative thriving in our community too. There is both a protective and an opportunity that happens. I want to tell you about human nature. I have no corner on human nature as a pastor. Other people have thoughts too, but I do think about that. If you would have a parking policy in this community, I would park on the street every night, no matter how passionately you told me the policy about how we should park. But because you have parking ordinances, and I don't have a garage, I do park in my driveway, even when I don't want to, even in those times when it's not convenient. And there's laws that prevent me. So there's something there that prevents me. But I also happen to see that opens up some possibilities for the city. It makes snow plowing possible. It makes tulip time possible. It allows me to see that, oh, this actually creates things for the community that by following something that maybe I have to do, it also allows things to happen that I couldn't have known otherwise. So this ordinance is required because people need protection. It also is an opportunity for you to make possible some new creative possibilities in our community, for people to be seen, their gifts to be a part of this community in a way that hasn't been fully received before. What a wonderful and wise opportunity you have as city council members to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Gord. Is there anyone else who would like to address council? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
Yes. My name is Jen Greenlee, and I live in North Holland. Last week, on short notice, I got to see what your policy compilation was, which, as was said, it was no different from the ordinance, except that the ordinance would allow for legal prosecution. But otherwise, they're both pretty similar. I do want to say that I was disappointed. As much as I appreciate the research and work that was done to prepare for the delivery of this last week, I really thought more research would have been done to present to us examples of other areas that have implemented an ordinance and shown us how successful they've been or not successful. When you do anything, you usually do a market research and you figure out what's been done here, what's been done there, and what have been the results. I didn't get any of that information. I'm disappointed in that. So if we look at what was delivered, it was like, okay, here you have a policy, here you have an ordinance. Nothing else is what we can choose from. I still believe we can have a policy, but that's not identical to what was provided or as the ordinance. but in a way that the policy can be addressed with, let's say, a task force or an ad hoc committee, or however we want to do it through the Human Relations Commission, so that we can come to a collaborative effort to resolve issues and problems. Now, as much as we have had a lot of complaints, and I apologize for those that have felt slighted and not feeling accepted for being of the LGBT community, of that culture, of that lifestyle, I do apologize for that. However, having been on the Human Relations Commission, I did not see any formal complaints. Now, normally, if you're going to do something, it's like you need to have a record of, we've had X amount of complaints, not just informal, not just anecdotal, not just testimonies, but formalized complaints. Where are those? Where is the gobs of complaints that should have gone through the Human Relations Commission? We don't have that. So we are going on feeling, emotions, individual experiences, which may or may not be real discrimination. How can we prove that? Now, SOGI laws would tend to protect people and prohibit discrimination, like with racial discrimination. However, because LGBT is a lifestyle, whether or not people would say they were born that way or not, I'm not getting into that, but it's still not an obvious, immutable type of characteristic. We will always have the DNA of an XX and an XY chromosome in us biologically if we're male or female. There aren't 20 genders, 70 genders, 100 genders. I'm sorry. There's still in every single person's cell a DNA that says XX, XY, male or female, regardless of the combinations people come up with. In general, SOGI laws will impinge on citizens' rights to run local schools and charities and businesses consistent with their values and their conscience. SOGI laws do not protect equality before the law. They instead grant special privileges that are enforceable against private individuals and parties. People are free to live as LGBT people, but they're not free to force all Americans to embrace and live out their beliefs about human sexuality. Coercion is a common practice that is done by this group, and we've seen it across the nation. It's taking place all over the country and wanting everybody to endorse their lifestyle. I'm not opposed to people living their lifestyle, but when it starts to encroach upon our rights, I don't think that's fair. Again, I believe a policy could be written to address formalized grievances so that we can really assess the situation to have enough evidence if somebody was truly discriminated against. I also want to say that in the words of our city attorney, how can you authorize what the state prohibits, and how can you prohibit what the state authorizes for wanting an ordinance? If the state prohibits discrimination, then you can't authorize it.
Thank you,
If the
Ms.
state
Greenlee. Your time
authorizes
has expired.
discrimination, then you can't prohibit it. Thank you.
Is there anyone else here who would like to address council? Seeing none, I will close the public comment period. Council, there is a motion on the floor that has received support. Is there discussion? Yes, Mr. Corbin.
So I ask you to bear with me because I have a lot of notes here that I'd like
And
to
I know
make.
it's hard to wear the mask, but
Yeah, well, okay.
we're doing our best, and we're asking the
I'll do
audience
my
to do that
best.
as well, so.
As long
it
as
is-
people can understand me, so. All right, so I just want to make it sure people understand today that whether a vote goes forward with a policy, that does not preclude us from moving forward with an ordinance. But one thing you can't do is you can't speak about an ordinance or policy without speaking to the ordinance. So I'm going to speak to both of them a little bit. So the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act of Public Act of 453 of 1976 prohibits discrimination based on religion, race, color, national origin, age, sex, height, weight, familial status, marital status, and that implies toward anything, employment and housing, education, or even public access, right? So in that vein, we have law that's established that addresses those specific issues already in state law. Some people are asking, well, what does that mean when it comes to sex? We really haven't defined that, but we have. But in this particular policy and or ordinance, we've never defined religion. We really never define height. We never define weight. We never define race. Is that true? And I would ask our attorney that question. We've never done that.
That's correct.
Okay, but we have defined specifically, we expanded definitions for sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity. And under Elliott Larson, the word gender is not even included, but yet we include it in, and we provide an additional amount of definition or expanded definition in our specific policy and or ordinance. So that's one thing that we need to probably address even if we move forward. So then how is sex defined by this Department of Civil Rights Commission, which the Supreme Court has ruled in the state that they have the authority to do. They have the authority to interpret. And that's because there's ambiguity. And they say because there's ambiguity in it, they have the right to do that. It's also not only interpreted by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, but it's also interpreted by recent Supreme Court ruling. And it does prohibit in the Supreme Court ruling acts that protections for gay, lesbian, transgender employees, discrimination based on sex regarding workplace discrimination, and so on and so forth. So there are three places, the Elliott Larson Act that describes sex, and then all these other areas of defined in the act itself. I'm having a hard time speaking with a mask, so I apologize. But it also has interpretive law based on the Michigan Civil Rights Commission and Supreme Court ruling on what sex means. So whether it be policy or whether it be ordinance, why do we go into the length of describing each and every one of them or adding them in there when we can just refer to those three pieces of legislation? And again, I'll kind of address that to our attorney.
Those definitions that you mentioned that are in the ordinance there come out of the model ordinance prepared by the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Those definitions, I understand, are what they interpret to be included, not the only thing, but included within the meaning of discrimination based on sex. But they're not in the statute. That's the department's interpretation. And because they're not in the statute, then their concern in adopting those, I understand, would be that shows what they understand it to be. And this be consistent with the Supreme Court ruling as well.
So that's the interpretive statement from Michigan Civil Rights Commission, which
Correct.
by all rights has the power of the law behind it when they adopt that.
Right.
So in essence, it's
Yeah.
law.
The interpretation by the Department of Civil Rights is not necessarily the law. They're given a great deference in terms of their interpretation of terms. The ultimate authority would be the courts, but that has not been decided in Michigan. For all practical purposes, that is the law of Michigan at this point, because that's what the department is enforcing,
And
until the courts say otherwise.
And the Civil Rights Commission could pursue adjudicating or prosecuting, I guess if you want to use that term, under the interpretive statement.
Correct.
So kind of the full length and arm of the law. They have the power to do that until such time a court decides differently.
Correct.
So, the city ordinance is adding disability, gender expression, education, source of income. We don't clarify that, what that means. When we do talk about disability, though, it's already determined under the Michigan Persons with Disability Act. Is that correct? That definition?
I believe there is, yes, yes,
So that's also in law as well,
correct.
okay? So, again, we don't have really, like, gender expression, education, source of income, we really don't define those either. And lastly, when it comes to the penalty phase, that concerns me a little bit, because we're applying penalties to this with a lot of ambiguity, not only at the state level and the federal level, but if we add this particular piece of language in there, we have to defend that language, correct?
Well, if somebody were to file an action to try and declare the ordinance as being invalid, we would be engaged to defend that ordinance or policy. That's correct.
Or if we decided to file against the ordinance or use that ordinance to file a claim against someone for violating it, correct?
Well, the ordinance is presumed to be valid if an ordinance is adopted. And so enforcing an ordinance comes with that presumption. It would be up to a person charged with, and we refer in the proposed ordinance to civil infraction. So it'd be up to a person charged with a civil infraction to decide if they want to challenge whether it's invalid or not.
Right.
But it comes with a presumption of validity once you adopt it, if
And
you adopt it.
Right, and it's important to add the civil infraction because if we don't, it automatically becomes a misdemeanor.
Correct.
And that's more than a preponderance evidence, it's a much greater level of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed that violation.
It's a higher proof standard, that's correct, and different penalties for misdemeanor, slightly different penalties. Well, not slightly. Misdemeanor includes the potential of a jail sentence. A civil infraction only carries with it a fine. Fine would be a typical misdemeanor penalty as well.
So with regard to the civil infraction, we intend to pursue that, right? I mean, of course, the policy says, and both the policy and the ordinance says, preferred action is to move it forward to the Civil Rights Commission and allow them to use the current weight of the interpretive statement and or current case law at the state level or case law at the federal level to prosecute. Is that correct? That's what our preferred method is.
So I think the one thing, because this came without recommendation, but the one thing that you heard your city manager probably say I'm going to recommend on is that the intent and the clear language in both the policy and the ordinance is that this is a referral process. So we would refer all of these cases to the appropriate, for housing, we'd refer it to the Fair Housing Center. And for all the other items, we'd refer it to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, which is why in the definition sections, while there were some definitions, we very clearly also identified that we didn't define other things because I think Ron used the term bootstrapped them to the terms used in the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act and the Michigan Persons with Disabilities Act.
So the comments made by the community under public comment, they would prefer an ordinance rather than policy because they would like the full weight of the policy and the intent behind us as a city to prosecute or to adjudicate what we said we're going to do. That's what I'm hearing from them. And so when I see that and we have no intention of doing that, we're just intending to forward it like we have always done, I'm wondering what the difference is between a policy and a ordinance at this point. And so when I look at the language that is written into a policy and or the ordinance, it seems that it's already in line with what is already in law. Two is if we don't intend as a city to enforce the language we adopt, and we're only referring it, I'm not sure what the difference is between the policy and the ordinance. It becomes very confusing for me. And this is not, for me, about whether or not, this is a process about how we build policy here in the city and making sure that it's very consistent how we build any other policy. So I'm a little concerned by that. But what I will say is, if today a policy was presented before us, I think all of us would agree to at least support that policy. And from policy, we do have the right to force or to push or to advocate with our departments and our agencies and our human relations department to take those complaints and move them forward. I think we're doing them now. I think we're doing a good job now. I hope we are. If not, we should be talking to our human relations department and our director about that. But I think this really tells everyone in the city that we're serious, that if these violations of state law or federal law takes place, we are serious about moving it forward. That's what a policy states. That's the policy of this board. That's the policy of the city, because we make that decision. So I think the first effort by this policy or by this council is to look how we create our policy, and then how then do we develop an ordinance that is reflective of that policy, that complements what's currently in both state and federal law. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Other comments from council members? Dave?
I'm going to make a very short attempt at addressing what I think I heard you talk about, Scott, and that is a concern about enforceability. And if we're referring any complaints to a state agencies for them to find remedy in that, then why would we want an ordinance? Did I hear that kind of correctly?
That's correct.
Okay.
And yes.
Then what came to mind then in response to that is, in the ordinance language, which we have, section 25-6, if I can read it through the fog here, deals with prosecution, and it says, for any complaint not within the jurisdiction of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, whom we would normally refer to for remedy for any complaints that we would get, it says the city may initiate an action to prosecute a violation of this chapter on the basis of an investigation initiated by complaint and investigated by the department. So what that says to me is the city is reserving the right for action in the event that the state, for whatever reason, would not act on our behalf. So there still is, a fair amount of meat in terms of prosecution in the ordinance section, which we're not dealing with right now. But I think I know, sorry. I think that might address one of the statements that you were concerned about, at least as I heard it.
So, but what you're saying is that somehow maybe our ordinance doesn't line up with the state, or they don't agree with how they line up, and maybe somehow we're forwarding something that they wouldn't pursue. But ours is mimicking the template, I believe, the template they provide and the language that they already provide. So it mirrors up exactly with what they already. So either if they kick it back to us, what are we going to do with it? Well, if we felt that there was merit in something we were to push to the state, and the state would not prosecute, let's use that, I hate to use that word because it's not really a prosecute, I guess. If they chose not to do that, and we're left holding that complaint, what do we intend to do by that? We say we may choose to do that. I'm just a little confused if we would actually do anything with that. And what I'm hearing is that we wouldn't. And so why are we creating any kind of, it says may, but what I've been hearing is our intention always has been to move it forward to the Civil Rights Commission and let them deal with it. So am I hearing from everyone here on this board, we intend to make sure, and if that's the case, then we should make sure it's in our policy. Or it should be in there that we will, not may, we will do everything within our means to pursue that. If we feel that's justified or has enough merit to move forward.
Can I just quickly respond to that? I get the feeling that we're dancing around a few definitions of terms and understanding of things, rightfully so. That's cool. I guess I would only respond by pointing out some past history. You know, right now, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights has taken a position on what they will accept in terms of complaints. So right now, if there's a complaint that deals with LGBTQ plus infraction, if you will, they are willing at this point to accept that complaint and investigate it and follow through with a remedy. That's a fairly major departure from what the position was, whether it was voluntary or imposed on them by a past administration. So the possibility exists, and I sort of liken the difference between policy and ordinance that follows this example. The possibility exists that a new administration comes along, a new attorney general comes along with a different point of view on this and says, no, the Department of Civil Rights is not going to take that stance. They're not going to investigate that because we feel it's wrong. We feel it doesn't apply. And being a policy at this point, it's not codified. The ability for a governmental entity at the state level to change that exists. So, in my mind, what the language says is if something like that should happen, we still have the right, we reserve the right to take some sort of action on behalf of our citizens to facilitate their complaints. That's the one fear I've had all along, I guess, talking about this, and I've voiced it before, is that without it being codified, a policy, can change according to the whims of any given sitting governmental entity or person. So this makes it an ordinance or a law, makes it much more substantial, much more difficult to counteract. So that's my response, I guess, to what I think I hear you saying.
Just one more follow-up. So remember, we mimicked the Civil Rights Commission's interpretive language of sex. And once we put that and codify that in ordinance, we will have to defend that if there is a decision made not to do just exactly what you decided. It will be brought back to us to do that. And so, one, we haven't defined some of these areas, like height. We haven't defined, height, weight. We haven't defined that. So, how are we going to do that then, or shouldn't we do that now as we go along? Because once it's codified and it's in the ordinance, there's going to be an expectation that first complaint that comes forward that we pursue that, or we may pursue that. But there's an expectation in this room that we are. There's an expectation in the community that we are. Are we given a false expectation? I don't see any nods, but are we providing a false expectation that we are not going to pursue this, that we're just going to refer this on to some other agency to do it, and then if they change their mind, that we might. I get a little confused with that. I would like to see us come together as a board, adopting something that we can, at least from a policy perspective, we can agree on. Then I'd like to work very quickly, on an ordinance of some sort and type that would do exactly what you're suggesting. I think we all could get behind some version of a policy. I'm just not sure right now we're ready to get, not today, not tomorrow, not next week. Maybe by the time that we're talking, the time frame we're talking, we may have that in writing somewhere. But I just think we need to find some way of making a statement now that these people, we care about them, we want to do what we can to protect them and protect their rights, and that we mean it from this point forward, from today on. And that's a policy statement. Whether anyone here likes that or not, it's still at least a commitment from us today. And that's what's before us, and that's what the motion is right now.
Comments from other members of council? Yeah, Lynn.
I can't get behind the policy, Scott. I think it would be very hard for me to come up, for us to be able to come up with language that would convince me that that has the force of law. The city attorney explained to us last week that a policy is really a statement of principle, which already is reflected in our mission statement and our vision statement, and so I think at this point we've been through 9 years of this, and we've come to this. We've already been having the conversation about policy and ordinance, maybe not using that language, but as a community we have been, and so now we're faced with whether we're going to actually take the step to say, yes, we feel it's important to protect these additional groups by law. And I think that I would want the city to be engaged in defending it if we have to. I mean, that's why we put it in place. So yeah, if the Civil Rights Department can't, for whatever reason, I think the city attorney said that there could be some reasons why they wouldn't pursue, then I think that's why we put it on the books, so that we would defend it, because we want to protect people. So for me, it would be very difficult to get behind a policy, because our current ordinance is incomplete. It would be so confusing to me to have a policy for some people and an ordinance for others. And if we can create a comprehensive ordinance that protects everyone, then I think we're in a much better position. And I hear what you're saying about the definitions, but I also think that if someone feels like they've been discriminated against because of a disability, or say for weight, because that's sort of vague, right? I feel like I've been discriminated against for my weight. I have to prove that that's what happened. We don't define what weight means, right? We just say, if I feel that way, then we're going to need to I'm going to need to come up with some proof for that. There's no way to define those, because they're different for everyone. So I think that I don't know. We haven't talked too much, Ron. We haven't talked too much about the defining those, but I feel like the more we define it, the more difficult it becomes, because we narrow it for people when all of them mean something different for people. So.
Keith, did you want to jump in? No, you're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Nikki?
Yes.
So I think that,
I'm sorry, Lynn.
yeah, that's fine.
No, keep going, please. I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, so I think that my point is that our current ordinance is incomplete. By adding this language, we could make it more complete. Actually, I realize I've shifted to ordinance, to talking about the ordinance. The policy just doesn't have the effect of law, and I would have a difficult time getting behind that.
Yeah. Scott?
Since the rebuttal was toward me, and if we adopt this policy, it's going to replace what you're speaking to, and it's going to have the additional languages. If today we agree to that language, it's there. The only thing that's going to be missing is the enforcement of, the enforcement portion, which is the only thing that's really missing between the two as we go toward an ordinance. So today we're establishing that we have a commitment to do the same thing we're going to do with an ordinance in the future. It's whether or not we're going to keep, or how we're going to pursue the legal actions. So, I mean, I don't see the argument today as saying, if I turn this down, I'm just holding out for an ordinance. No, it's a commitment today, right now, with the motion on the table, to take care of these people who are asking for it. And we're going to tell our departments and our agencies, and we're telling the community that we mean business. So I don't know why we would vote it down, what the purpose of voting down something like that would be, when it's identical to the ordinance, to the penalties missing. That's the only thing that's different. So The referral's the same, the definition's the same, the referrals are the same, just not the penalty.
Go ahead, Lynn.
But policies are not enforceable by law. It's a policy that could get put in a drawer in 3 years if the people in charge so wanted it. So there is a policy. I think by having this conversation, that's our commitment, but I think we need to take a stronger stand and say, not only are we committed, but we're committed to protecting you by law.
One last thing, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, fire away.
So it is protected by law because the language is in the Elliott-Larsen Act. It's in the interpretive language by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, and it's backed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So it is law, and all we're doing is saying, just likewise with the policy, that if it's a violation of the law, and that's our policy, is we're referring it to the Civil Rights Commission for prosecution. So we're saying the exact same thing. So it already is, what we're saying is law. We're not saying anything different. We're mimicking exactly what the interpretive language by the Civil Rights Commission has said is what the term sex is and beyond. So I don't get where it's any different in the passage of an ordinance, but if there are sanctions locally we want to imply later down the road as an ordinance, I'm all for those discussions. But today we're talking about passing a resolution or a policy reflecting who we are as a city and what we're doing for the people that are sitting in this audience and the people that are sitting out in the parking lot, the people listening at home. If we want to make a statement, a strong statement today, today's the day to make it. We can do it today. The other one, we have to wait a couple more readings. We have to wait a couple more times before we get down that road, if we get down that road. But I think at least from a council perspective, there's a large number of us that want to make that statement. And I would hope that my colleagues would support at least starting with a policy.
And I'm gonna jump in here. I usually wait until the end, but Scott, I got to say this. I don't want to just say something. I want to do something. We have a system of laws in this city, and that's how we do business. We don't have a system of policies in this city that is how we do business. We have a system of laws, and those laws have teeth, and those laws have penalties, and those laws have ways to be able to deal with the issues. And it's very different, in my mind, between a policy and an ordinance. A policy is what we say we'd like to do. An ordinance is what we do. And that's a very important difference in my mind. We have for years had a non-discrimination ordinance on the books in the city of Holland to protect a certain group of people. I think it would be an insult for us to put a policy in place for another group of people. I think it would be tantamount in my mind to saying to this group of people, we don't think that you deserve the same level of treatment and protection by the city of Holland that this group that has been protected by a non-discrimination ordinance. It's two different levels of protection for two different groups of people. And in my mind, that is the textbook definition of discrimination. Yeah, go ahead.
We're not creating two different policies. There's a policy on the hand. I guess we'd have to rescind the other policy, but we're trying to combine the two policies to include everyone.
We have an ordinance in place right now that
Right.
protects a particular group of people.
Ordinance.
And if I'm hearing you right,
Yeah.
you're saying,
I'm not disagreeing that
Okay.
an ordinance isn't that there's not a reason to move forward with an ordinance. What I'm saying is making a statement of policy right now that that's what we agree to moving forward. I think if it's that important today, we should be making the statement today. Just like you said, let's do something. Let's do something. Let's act. And today is our opportunity to act.
but I disagree that putting a policy in place is doing something. I see that more as saying something. We have an ordinance, we have a draft ordinance that has been put before us as a possibility that is based upon model ordinance language that's out there, Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act that's out there. And I understand and I get your desire to have more certainty in terms of definitions, but I've been an attorney for 28 years. The one thing I've learned is that there is not a way to be able to draft an ordinance that will prospectively be able to anticipate every circumstance that might come down the road. And Lynn, what you said, I believe, is exactly right. And weight's a good example of that. What does discrimination in regard to weight mean? Well, it depends on not only on the person, it depends on the circumstances. And that's specifically the reason why some of these definitions are a little more vague, because some discrimination based on weight in one circumstance may not be discrimination based on weight in another circumstance. And as Lynn said very well, the onus is going to be on the person who believes that they were discriminated against to make the case that that was the reason for the action, that discrimination was the reason for the action. We're never going to be able to get to a point where we have all-encompassing definitions for these situations. That's the reason why I got a room full of law books at my office, because those definitions are being interpreted and reinterpreted all of the time based on the specific situation that's in front of us at the time. And the same thing goes for when you ask the question of, well, if the state doesn't do it and it comes back to us, are we going to guarantee that we're going to do it? And my answer to that question is, it depends, because it depends on the circumstances. If it is a valid case that the city of Holland believes needs to move forward, it should move forward. But maybe it's not. But the question in my mind that's before us today is, do we say to the people of Holland that we are going to respect and protect the rights of everyone in this community at the same level? And in my mind, doing a policy for one and an ordinance for another group does not do that. So, questions from other members of council, comments? Quincy?
I guess, can you clarify what you said about enforcement? Like,
yeah, there's a portion in the ordinance. We're talking about the policy now, but I think they're kind of wrapped up with one another in this portion of the discussion. There's a portion in the enforcement section of the ordinance language that essentially says, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially says, if the Civil Rights Commission chooses not to take the referral that we have given to them, we reserve the right, we may do an enforcement procedure ourselves and try to impose a civil infraction on the person that's violated the ordinance.
and we may or may not do that.
Right. There is in every level of the law, and Scott, you are a police officer, you know this. There's what's called prosecutorial discretion at every level. You know, if you get a police car that pulls you over because you were speeding, you don't always get a ticket. Sometimes you get a warning. You sometimes get a stern talking to. You sometimes do get a ticket. You may go in front of the judge, and the judge may decide that what you did didn't warrant that. We have the opportunity as a city to be able to pick and choose our battles, essentially. And so I'm going to turn this over to Ron because I want to make sure that I'm on the right track with this for our city attorney, but that we do have the option to be able to choose what we want to pursue.
That's correct. There's discretion in prosecuting any type of offense or civil infraction. If the Department of Civil Rights investigates and determines that there's no violation, I think we'd be hard pressed to say we would go forward. But there are circumstances where they might not pursue an investigation very far, or they might pursue it and say there's a violation here, but we don't have time to prosecute it, for example. Yeah. There are circumstances where we might want to enforce it ourselves. But normally we would, under this proposed policy, we would refer it to them and they would pursue it.
All right, thank you. Other questions or comments from council members? Quincy?
So yeah, I have a couple. So what would protect the city from being sued through the way everything's set up right now? I guess that would be a Ron question.
Well, it's been said many times that anybody can sue somebody for anything. It doesn't mean that they're going to win. So yeah, there could be an action filed by someone challenging the ordinance, the validity of the ordinance. It wouldn't be the first time something like that's been done. We believe that the ordinance is totally valid, as the policy would be as well if adopted by council, because it mirrors state law, and state law that's been on the books for many years. Interpreted different ways at different times, but been there for many years. So we believe that it'd be entirely valid. We do build into it defenses and exceptions that are in state law, so we wouldn't be challenged as to you know, on the basis of trying to do something that the state allows.
Yeah, Keith.
Yeah, Quincy, let me just, I think Ron is absolutely right. I support what he said, but I even go back to the original charge to myself and Ron, and I'm trying to pull it up here a second, excuse me, did include, we haven't talked a lot about this, but it talked about should include possible risk or exposure to the city of Holland. You may recall that that was one of the original things. And Ron and I did have several conversations about that. And I'm gonna say what he just said, but in a slightly different way, answering your question. We don't believe there's any difference in risk or exposure to lawsuits, which was your question, between the policy and the ordinance. I don't believe there's any difference in risk or exposure between adopting the policy or the ordinance. The other thing I'd just like to add, because we're talking about it, and it just kind of dawned on me that even though we've had many conversations about this, there may be someone sitting in the audience or viewing from home, and I don't think that I made clear in my initial report, because we've talked about referring this out. And I'd just like to make clear, because we've talked about this before, but those that may not be aware, really the core reason that we've talked about that we think that the referring out process is good, and we think it has other advantages administratively, but it's primarily because the remedies that are available at the state level are much greater than what we would have here locally, regardless of what we do in the ordinance. So I just want to make that perfectly clear that for anyone here in person or listening, either live or recorded in the future, the primary reason for doing or at least one of the very large reasons for doing the referral, is because the remedy in the case that there actually was determined to be a case of discrimination is much greater at the state level than it would be here at the municipal level. Thank you.
Thank you,
So,
Keith.
Another question, follow-up from what you said, though. So for what risk and exposures do we have inherently for adopting either a policy or an ordinance? And I guess
I would
also-
feel that there's not much. Ron said you can get sued for anything, and we do, right? However, we drafted this in such a way that we not only think provides the best protections in the case of discrimination, because the state has more remedies to them, but we also very specifically crafted what we put in front of you in order to limit that risk and exposure as much as possible. So I absolutely agree with Ron in saying that we feel that what's before you equally in the policy or the ordinance gives a great degree of protection to the city from risk and exposure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Another
keep
question.
going, sure.
So as our Christian community, some of them are concerned about this. How, we talked a little bit about this last week, but how would they be protected? So one of the things was the situation that happened in, I believe it's Colorado with the baker. How would a business owner be protected? And also, I guess, individuals.
So I'm going to let Ron answer that, but basically in multiple places, we have taken the full weight of law that exists at the federal and the state level and referenced it here in this ordinance.
Can you elaborate on that?
That is correct. Anything that's protected by the Michigan Constitution or by the United States Constitution is exempt from the application of this ordinance. That's in the exception section in the ordinance. And then at the end, the interpretive language at the end of the at the end of the ordinance and the policy indicates, let me just get the language, that the ordinance or policy should not be read to prohibit or interfere with a person's or religious institution's free exercise of religion as protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution or by the Michigan Constitution. And so we've built into that, those documents, the protection that people have under our Constitution.
So out of that, is there anything that is not protected for a Christian in that sense?
That's a hard thing to answer, anything, because the extent of the religious defense, religious beliefs defense, is really not fully developed by the courts at this point. As a point on that, the Supreme Court decision that interpreted the term sex, one of the things that they said specifically in their opinion is, we're not getting into determining the extent of that defense. That's for a future case. The courts will decide an issue that's presented before them, and most courts at least will only decide that issue and limit their decision because the other issues that are not presented are not fully developed, and that's what the Supreme Court has said there. Having said that, they have other decisions that relate to the religious beliefs type of defense and related cases. So there are some cases out there, but basically the defense is really not fully developed by the courts at this point. So to say anything is a little too broad. But I think the courts have been rather clear in saying that, and it's not just the courts, but there's a federal statute on there too, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that prohibits the governments from imposing burdens on the person's exercise of their religious beliefs. And that's why in the Hobby Lobby case a few years ago, the court ruled in favor of the business owners' religious beliefs. That's why the court just a couple of weeks ago, maybe not even a couple of weeks ago, issued an opinion dealing with another issue where they indicated that the government's regulations that included an exception related to religious beliefs was something that was authorized by law. And so that is something that they respect greatly, and it's something that will be developed over time yet.
Okay, one more question. So you said cases. Is it possible you could share some cases via email?
Sure. We could maybe be better at presenting that at the next meeting or a study session, but yeah.
That'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions, comments from council?
It's up to me, isn't it?
You don't have to say anything if you don't want to.
You have to say
All
something.
right.
I was the one that made the motion, so it'd probably be fitting that I do say something.
Mr. Chathui, do you have something you'd like to share?
I do.
All right.
First of all, I'm going to agree with a lot with what was said from both the audience and council tonight. I do have to, and I'm not going to get in a big discussion with the Reverend, but I also happen to be on the consistory of a church here, and we're going through the Vision 2020. I can't grasp your statement that the RCA has grabbed the liberal side, if I heard you correctly. If I misheard you, I apologize. And that's why Vision 2020 is going on right now, because the RCA is grappling with that. And it's not just about the LGBT, it's about how we talk to each other, about a number of different things. Lynn, I'm going to come very, very short of saying I would not be able to support a ordinance. I haven't made my mind up yet. Not saying that you're wrong. Don't get me, I'm not saying that at all. But it's very interesting that the fourth word in our policy, in our ordinance, is the city has a policy. Policy precludes and precedes the ordinance. As a number of you are well aware, I was one of the members, one of the three members that are left up here now. I was the only member, and I voted no. I will not apologize for that. I gave an explanation at that point. I said to the Reverend Freeman at the time, and he and I had had coffee a number of times, you put a vote in front of the people, I will be the first to sign the paper to have that done. At that point, I had had a 50-50 split in my constituents. The only time in all the years I've been up here that I've had that. Things have changed, obviously. The city has changed. I know things have been thrown back at me that I'm trying to be too slow on this, trying to be too cautious, trying to, okay, great, that's me. 64 years, I'm not going to change. But what I feel very, very, very strongly about in this whole discussion, and I said it last week and I mean it, I do not like discrimination of any kind, way, shape, or form. There is one person, I'm sorry if I'm boring you. There's only one person of the 9 of us up here that can probably really, really talk to discrimination. And he's talked about that. We have feelings, we have understandings, we have anecdotal information from fine people like yourselves. I understand what is being said, that we can't have two separate things here. We already have an ordinance in place for housing. I do have a question on that because we've got a tad bit of inconsistency. And unfortunately, my computer, electronics is not being friendly to me today. In our language on the policy, it very specifically says those in blue are not part of our ordinance. There's one word in there, sex, encompassed by the other words. The ordinance has that in black. Now, was that a typo? So if you look right there, that's in blue. If you look at the ordinance, it is black. So I do believe that our ordinance, our housing ordinance that we have right now, does have that word in it, correct?
Yes, it does. That was a typo there.
All right.
It was corrected in the ordinance, missed in the policy.
Okay.
Right.
The reason I bring that up is because, very similar to what Scott said, I'm grappling with the definitions if we already have some of this out there. Do we need the redundancy? And what I'm about to say here, there's going to be some more scoffs from the audience. I can hear it already. What has changed in me in the discussions and what we went through 9 years ago? Is how we want to change people. I had a nice discussion with a lady over the weekend that challenged me, and I greatly appreciate that on my stance. And I just simply said back to her, laws don't change people's hearts. Policies do. She brought up the seat belts. She brought up civil rights, and it was brought up tonight. There was a couple other things, the parking, the Reverend talked about the parking. People are going to comply, but are they going to change their hearts? Are they going to change their attitudes? I've heard an awful lot of conversation about people feel this way. Okay, somebody may act a certain way because the law is there, but truly deep down in their heart, are they going to change? Are the people that are feeling unwelcome here going to feel more welcome just because we have that law? Some people are saying yes. I'm nodding heads. But if that law was out there and somebody did not discriminate you the way it's defined in here, but yet gave you an attitude that they didn't like you, that gonna make you feel any better? I don't think so. So yes, as you can hear, I'm very conflicted. Very conflicted. We have done very well in the city, and Jay and I chatted about it just a little while ago on the short-term housing. We tend to do things a little bit on the conservative side to make sure that we have it right, and then we roll it out, just like we did with that. We already have a policy on the books right now for housing. It's missing a couple of words. I'm not going to agree that we're doing two different groups of people, because I have a solution for that, which may or may not go. But as far as the other 2 or 3 areas that we're trying to address, there's gonna have to be some more discussion. I, a little bit like, not a little bit, but I, like Scott, say that if we put this policy, at least part of it, into play tonight, it becomes effective immediately. With the ordinance, we've got the very first potential would be the first meeting in August. You've waited 9 years. What's a couple of more weeks? I can hear that already, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. What I'm saying tonight, folks, is not very popular. I cannot apologize for that. We represent 30,000 people around this city. I'm not speaking for myself. I'm just giving you the other side. I'm giving my colleagues the other side. I believe that they have all gone out and talked to some other constituents. We're not 100% on this. But if we're going to do something like this, and I truly believe we need to do something, otherwise I wouldn't have made the motion back in January. And the mayor and I have talked about it. We want to do something that works, that we know that can be functional, that we know that's going to be, and we're not, been around long enough that I know that we're not going to please everybody. It is what it is. But the bottom line here is, and I think if I'm hearing every one of you, whether you're on this side or that side, whatever the case may be, we need to change people's hearts and attitudes. And I have not made up my mind, but I want to tell you and have you clearly hear me right now. If I happen to vote against the ordinance, I'm not voting against the content. I'm voting against the tool. That's going to be interpreted any way you want to. That's fine. That's your prerogative. That's your right. But I'm laying that out right now. It's going to take 9 of us around this, or at least 5, to pass whatever we do. I do feel strongly at this point that at least partially the policy is the proper way to go. The modification of the existing housing ordinance that we have to include some of the definitions that you're looking at, I could probably get behind it because we have the ordinance already in place. We're trying to encompass the, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the education, the employment, and what's the fourth one? Public accommodation, thank you. I would like to see a hybrid, and I have a feeling I know which way this is going to go. I would like to see a hybrid then of the other 3 areas so that we can develop them. I'd like to see some empirical data. I'm a numbers guy. The way that we do things right now, if a complaint is made, unfortunately, the city knows nothing about it until there's a remedy. Yeah. There's going to be some that say that he's just blind, he's just ignorant. Okay. I'm a big boy, I can take it. But you have to know how I feel. I am representing not only my ward, but I'm representing the city of Holland in my statements, my belief. We will not, any one of us, ever represent 100% of the people. We can't. It's simply impossible. I'm just giving you some food for thought on the other side.
Thanks, Mike. Quincy, did you have some comments?
So Mike asked a comment about changing hearts and asked if a law would do that. And some people said yes. And I will be the first to tell you that is absolutely not the truth. We've had law in place for blacks to have certain rights and be treated certain ways, and I still face racism. So that doesn't work to the tune that your expectation may be set. One of the things that I guess I'm wondering is, it seems as if I'm for a policy. I think a policy would be a first step. I don't see a tier of one group gets this and a different group gets that. The end goal to me is we are protecting individuals in our community who are not protected right now. And I really have to agree with Scott when he says that this would be making a statement.
Quincy.
I don't see how voting on a policy would hamper us from still meeting our end goal of looking at an ordinance and putting an ordinance in place. It seems like there's this conflicting, it's either or. And I guess I don't understand the idea of it being an either or. So I guess I'm looking for someone to help me understand that right now.
Thank you, Quincy. Nikki, yeah.
Before I say my little piece, I have to comment on you, Mike. I'm delighted to hear that you think Quincy is the only one who has been discriminated against, because I grew up before Title IX, and I was never able to be an altar girl. So I think women have come a long way. But I do want to say an ordinance, in my opinion, is what gives this teeth. And I have to agree with the mayor in saying we already have it in place, and a vote not to add on to this ordinance is a vote for discrimination. And that's where I stand. We need an ordinance, and we need to add to it, and I appreciate council's putting the additions and deletions in different colors. That helped a lot to go through that. We need an ordinance, and we need to add on the other categories in all, whether it's employment or housing or whatever, in one anti-discrimination ordinance. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki.
Mm-hmm.
Scott?
Just trying to clarify Quincy's question, because if today we vote on a policy, that does not preclude us from moving ahead with an ordinance. Today's vote is about this policy, and if we're going to act today and start today about not discriminating against the people, the very people that we've outlined here today. And back to your point, do we want to make a statement? Do we want to create a policy that reflects that? That is the question before us right at the moment. Are we going to act tonight, or are we going to act a month from now or 2 months from now, whenever we decide what that language is going to be in the ordinance?
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Raul?
So I shared last week that, you know, my preference towards an ordinance, so I won't get into that too much. But I am kind of tracking a little bit with Scott. Like, I think I understand what you've been talking about, some of your rationale. And I guess there are just a couple questions. You know, so I made a comment last week as well that, you know, some of the things that we've been asked to include when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community is sexual orientation and gender identity, I believe, right? But we added another piece to that, right, that we're saying is included kind of in the interpretation of the Department of Civil Rights, and then also the Supreme Court decision, or the Elliott Larson. But those two interpret sex, right? So those only include sex, but they interpret it to include these other three kind of more broadly defined, I guess, terms, right?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
But they only say sex, but they interpret sex to mean these other three things as well.
Because the longer definitions of those are in the Elliott Larson Act. So they're contained, so in the other areas that contained here, we included these definitions, and I think the model ordinance included the longer definitions in these instances because they weren't incorporated in the legislation.
Okay. And then, so at this point, I know this isn't the vote right now, we're voting on policy, but then we're gonna vote on ordinance potentially. There's no timeline for that yet, right? I mean, we have a first reading, and then we decide when that's going to be. I mean, it could be a long time. It could be the next couple meetings, which I think is going to be our preference. But that's not guaranteed. And so the other question is, if we did vote on policy, right, approved a policy, and then also approved an ordinance, right, or at least to move forward with a first reading, we can do that, right? And so we're saying we can do that. I mean, it's kind of odd, maybe, right?
Yes.
But we can do that. I mean, I have no idea how the vote's going to turn out, so I'm just kind of counting what could be.
Thank you, Raul.
Is that
Yeah, Mike.
Let's get clarification on that, because Ron's given me that. I don't know how this is going to turn out. Look, let me ask it this way, Raul. Ron, what would be the pitfalls if they ran parallel for the time being?
If they ran parallel, well, policy takes one vote to adopt.
Right.
And so that could be adopted tonight. The ordinance requires a first and a second reading. And so that can't, well, it could be adopted as an emergency ordinance tonight, but, you know, probably is not an emergency. But it would take a second reading then next time. Going forward with the policy and the ordinance, you know, we want to make sure that there's no inconsistencies, and I don't think there are, because they're worded virtually the same. There, we you know, drafted the policy based on the language in the ordinance. And so I don't think that there's a downside to both. The ordinance includes a policy statement at the beginning that it's the policy of the city, again, if adopted, policy of the city to oppose discrimination.
And we could possibly have some language in the motion, either more than likely at the ordinance, when and if we get to that point, saying as soon as the 21 days is over after the second vote, the policy is rescinded, the ordinance takes over at that point. Something along that line of.
Yeah, an ordinance, because it's a law, it's a city's law, would take precedent over a policy, correct?
Exactly, okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments?
No, I think I would like to mention to the public that there's been a lot of participation, a lot of comments, and that every council member has received and reads and truly considers every comment. I just want to make that clear, because you know, sometimes it seems a little uneven, or like we're dismissing one or the other. We really do consider that, and the other part is with the public, there was some concern about religious freedoms or other freedoms or abilities being diminished with this, should this policy or ordinance get passed. And it really doesn't. It's not a pie that we're not sharing. It's everyone's freedom and everyone's ability to not be discriminated against. It's not taking away anything from anyone else's area. Is that true? Right.
Great. Thank you, Nikki.
You're welcome.
Other comments, questions? Mike, you and I have worked together a lot on this. And I feel a little bit badly that I think you might feel like you're in the hot seat on this tonight. And Scott, you and I went back and forth on this. There's absolutely no animosity with any member of this body. We just like to get into some heated debates every now and then and discussions with one another. And I think that makes us come up with better answers on this. And you're right, as I've said, I want to do something. But I want to make sure, as Mike, you and I have said throughout this process, whatever we do, I want to do it right. And there's been talk tonight about people that are on the margins and about discrimination. And Nikki, you're exactly right. We listen and take in and mull over and fret over the comments that we get and that we receive. And I want to tell the members of the audience, I was deeply moved by a lot of the comments that I heard this evening. I do my best to be as stoic as I can when I sit up here, and it was very difficult to listen to some of the stories and the presentations that you gave. I've never really lived on the margins. I've never really been discriminated against. If you haven't noticed, I'm an upper middle class, heterosexual, white Christian male living in America. Arguably the most privileged type of person that there is in the world. I've never been on the margins, but this is still a deeply personal issue for me. And I like to think I'm an analytical guy, and I'm going to go a little bit the opposite direction right now, and so please bear with me. I grew up in a household with a father that was dedicated to looking for and protecting people who were on the margins. When it wasn't a very popular thing to do, he was on the state board of the Michigan Special Olympics because he wanted to make sure that people with disabilities had as many advantages and as many opportunities as possible. He was on the board of directors of the Urban League. He marched in civil rights marches. He led his students march in civil rights marches. It wasn't his job. His job, he was an educator. And so maybe it was his job, because I know that's what he taught me. There's one story that I often tell that is the epitome of who my dad was. I was at kindergarten visitation with my oldest son, and my dad came along. And so my son had dad and grandpa at kindergarten visitation. And we were there doing the things that you do with the kids at kindergarten visitation, and it came time to sit down in the big circle where we were all going to share what the kids were going to share what they were doing that day. And suddenly my dad wasn't there. My dad had noticed that there was a little girl sitting off in the edge of the room who did not have anyone there for parent visitation day. So my dad made her parent for the day, and he sat with her. And I was a little frustrated with my dad at the time because my dad was supposed to be there for my son and for me, and I was proud of my dad that he was there, and my son was proud that Grandpa was there for him. But Grandpa wasn't there for him at that moment because Grandpa knew that my son was not one that was on the margins, but this little girl was. So while I'm not someone who's been on the margins, and I'm not someone that's been discriminated against, I was taught to always look for those people that were on the margins and to do what I could to protect the people that were on the margins, to reach out to the people that were on the margins, and to bring the people that were on the margins into the circle with the rest of us who have never had that feeling before, who have never had that discrimination before. And I agree with you, Mike, and I agree with you, Quincy. A policy or an ordinance is not going to change hearts and change minds. I was elected by the people of the city of Holland not to change hearts, not to change minds, but to protect the rights of every single person in this community. Now, everybody in this community may not agree with me. As Mike, as you said, I'm never going to be able to represent every member in this community in a way that every member of this community is going to be happy with the way that I represent them. But I am going to do everything I can to protect the rights of every single person in this community. And I absolutely cannot vote for a policy that it will provide a second-tier standard for one group of people in this community when we have an ordinance in place that protects another group. And we could very easily do it right. Do the job that we have been asked to do by the members of this community to protect their rights, to do it right, and put an ordinance in the place that protects everyone, all of those people that are on the margins. This is an incredibly personal thing for me, because my job is to protect the rights of everyone in this community. Kathy, please call the roll.
Peters? Garcia?
Yes.
Trethewey?
Yes.
Arnshorst?
No.
Corbin?
Yes.
Hoekstra?
No.
Raymond?
No.
Byrd?
Yes.
Mayor Box?
No.
5 no, 4 yes.
Motion fails.
Motion fails.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, item 12C2, ordinance option for City Council to consider regarding proposed protection against discrimination as requested by City Council. Mr. Van Beek.
I'm thinking deeply at this point what possibly I can say that would set up the ordinance any different than the discussions that we've had now. And probably going with my better judgment, I'm going to say I'm happy to answer any questions, as is City Attorney Vanderveen.
Any questions, comments from council? Otherwise, I will entertain a motion.
Move to approve?
Moved by Hoekstra. Is there support? Support by Peters. Now I will open the floor for public comment in regard to the ordinance. Is there anyone here who would like to speak to City Council in regard to the ordinance? Please remember that the same rules are in place in regard to public comment at this point. We still do have the 5-minute rule. There are still the 3 lights, the green light, the yellow light, and the red light. This will be one-way communication. This is your opportunity for you to speak to us. So at that, is there anyone who would like to address council? Please come forward, and please state your name and address for the record.
Hello, my name is Kelly Palan. I live at 1892 Parkcrest Drive Southwest in Wyoming, Michigan. I use she, her pronouns, and I frequently work as a communications technician in the Holland Zealand area. So I've called Holland my home on and off for the better part of my life. I find it appalling that while there are protections for some residents, those same protections don't apply to all. The fact that I can be legally discriminated against and lose my housing or employment if someone disagrees with my gender identity or sexual orientation is a constant concern of mine and of others in the LGBTQIA community. While Holland is a wonderful place to live and work, all of that can be taken away from someone such as myself on a whim. We face far less discrimination than we once did, but it's still present in the area, and we all deserve equal protection under the law. While I think it's truly wonderful that the council is considering a policy change is simply not enough to protect the most vulnerable among us. Without the force of law and an enforcement mechanism, discrimination will continue unabated by those who wish to do it. We need protection under an ordinance so there is legal recourse for those that the current NDO does not protect. I urge the council to vote in favor of extending the protections already enjoyed by some in our community to so many others, and thereby improving the quality of life for all who live and work in Holland. As Mayor Bach said, law can't change people's hearts and minds, but it can protect those who need it. And thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Is there anyone else who would like to address council? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
My name is Sarah Jor van Oosterhout. I'm a resident of 129 East 22nd Street in Holland. I'm also the founder and managing attorney at Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates, a nonprofit immigration law office and advocacy center serving the greater Holland area since November of 2015. There is unprecedented unrest in the United States. Not only are we living through a pandemic where the United States' systemic racial and socioeconomic inequities have been laid bare, but riots and protests over police brutality are raging across the country. The jig is up. Many people in the United States are fed up with systems, policies, politics, and practices that kill our Black neighbors, cage our Latinx neighbors, and deny fundamental rights to our LGBTQ neighbors. The frustrating thing, though, is there are so many people who do not realize they are part of the jig. Those same people who say, oh, I'm not racist, or, oh, if only the illegal aliens came the legal way, or I only have a problem with the sin, not the sinner. The same people who see the ordinance as a violation of their religious freedoms. The same people who believe religious freedoms means the right to make everyone else abide by Christian teachings and values. Their ignorance, denial, and coded racism and bigotry is a disease and one major reason why these policies and systems persist. And Holland is home to so many of these people who are very wealthy and well organized and have state and local political leadership on a short leash. Public comments from HRC members, and letters both earlier this year and just last week plainly show why Holland needs to pass an ordinance and not just a policy to protect many of our neighbors whose interests have historically been underrepresented or suppressed by the majority. Just last month, the Supreme Court issued a historic decision ruling the 1964 Civil Rights Act offers protections to gay, lesbian, and transgender employees. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is federal law. The law preempts other state laws or local ordinances, which means it does not matter one iota what you or I think about non-discrimination ordinances in Holland. It is federal law, and while the City of Holland is welcome to enact their own stronger, more precise civil rights laws, making the protections more accessible, they cannot do anything less than the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Holland had a chance to do the right thing, to send a clear message of support to its LGBTQ residents before the Supreme Court ruled, both back in 2011 and earlier this spring. Now, frankly, it does not matter what Holland decides to do this week. Federal law has preempted any gesture Holland might make in the field of employment protections, but an ordinance would certainly make it clearer and easier for victims of discrimination to file complaints, and it would send a clear message of support and solidarity to victims of discrimination. And as far as housing protections, Holland cannot have an ordinance protecting only some people. Only some people in employment and housing, and only a policy or nothing extending those same protections to now federally protected groups of people. Those opposed to this ordinance are missing the point of this type of protection. Ensuring equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. We are not divvying up slices of pie. And it is not a matter of giving special rights to small contingents within the community. It's about making sure that those in our community who have been historically underserved, underrepresented, or discriminated against receive political rights, procedural fairness, and the right to seek legal redress, and the rights of participation where they otherwise would not. It's not about changing hearts and minds. Religious feelings about varying sexuality and gender identity are personal feelings that have no bearing on natural justice in law. On a personal note, I am a queer, agnostic, nonprofit immigration attorney. I am married to a cisgender hetero man, and I have 2 biological children. It is so easy for folks to look at me and pretend I'm just another cisgender, hetero resident of Holland, but I'm not. Living in a place where you barely feel tolerated, as opposed to accepted or celebrated, is extremely challenging, made more challenging by the lack of legal redress for discrimination and statement of support and acceptance from my elected officials. This vote on the non-discrimination ordinance should be a no-brainer. Just a policy is simply not enough at this point, as you've already decided. A policy would be a paltry conciliatory gesture, meaning nothing, and only demonstrating that Holland leadership answers only to those who hold their short leashes. Pass the ordinance.
Thank you, Sarah. Is there anyone else who would like to address council on this issue? And would you please state your name and address for the record, please?
My name is William Hescott. I live at 1043 Pine Grove Drive in Holland. Hello, councilors, Mr. Mayor. I wasn't planning on speaking today. In fact, I was just planning on hopefully grabbing a quick word with one or two of you after the meeting about affordable housing, about some ideas that I had. But I was moved to speak by several members of the audience who spoke before me, and I thought that maybe I could contribute something. The last time I was here, the first meeting I attended for City Council, was in late December. I was greeted by many of the same faces that I see here in the crowd today, and Then, too, the speakers inspired me to say something, so I hastily scribbled out some words in my notebook, but ran out of time to say what I had intended before I could. I am not gay. I've been straight my whole life, and I think it's unfortunate that such a simple, uncontrollable feeling can make such a difference between the life of myself and the many others that are in this room. If you look at me, I'm a taller, white Dutch guy, raised in the church. I'm pretty much who you'd expect to see if you walked into Holland. I'm like the ugly version of the Russ's boy. But even for me, I found myself recently homeless and, like many others here, jobless. It was hard enough for me to find a place to live. It was hard enough to find a job that pays the bills. And I cannot imagine being in a situation in which an immutable characteristic makes that search harder and can result in the loss of one or both of the two, housing or a job, after the fact. Mr. Cherthrui, you said that an ordinance cannot change the minds of the people, and I agree with you. But we find ourselves now in a job crisis with cases coming back up. It looks like many people may lose their jobs again, and a housing crisis as a result of people not having jobs. And I think whether or not you change the hearts or minds of the people who are in a position to discriminate against people of the community, I think it doesn't matter if their minds change or not, because people need somewhere to live. People need a job where they can put food on the table for themselves. And the city has the power to do that. And I hope that maybe some of the words that I'm saying here get through to you guys and you can make that change. As a person deeply interested in politics at all levels of government, one of the most common complaints of fellow political junkies is that there's a great lack of political engagement from the population. Almost everyone who I know or who I have heard speak, they want more people to engage. This room was full 9 years ago, and they spoke. This room was full in December when people spoke. And right now, today, the room is about as full as it can be, even in the face of one of the most deadly viruses, illnesses, plagues that we've had in over a century. So I hope that since we can all see how full this room is, and since we can see how much the people care and want this policy done, that the council can act and implement the will of the people who have come here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. Is there anyone else who would like to address council?
name is May Klein Hexel, 9653 Hiawatha in West Olive, and I do business in Howland. I'm speaking today in regards to the public study session presented by the City Manager Verbeek and City Attorney Vanderveen. The comments last week had many emotional, heartbreaking stories of hurt in the community. I'm unaware why the ordinance is being revisited when, according to your attorney, there are proper channels set in place already. Most of the complaints have not been addressed through the proper avenues. I encourage the community to be educated and to pursue injustice. The proposed and current projected classes are myopic. There is not any protection for breastfeeding persons. Some of the obvious things that were missed, for example, disability, were missed because the statements that already exist in other forms of law. We do not need an extra bureaucracy layer to bring grievances to the city. The City of Howland cannot and should not pass an ordinance on emotion. The unwise choice will make it so that the city itself cannot hire the best. They must, under its own myopic constrictions, hire the most protected. The City of Howland has job opportunities for police officers today. Discrimination of who fits the job best is essential in the interview process. Perhaps the city should pick a police officer by lot. It is the best way to ensure that you are not raising one's rights above another's. The last time I spoke in public comments, I was not as well planned. I want to thank the board, the city manager, attorney, and the outside groups for pursuing recognition of rights. I have learned that the founding fathers saw parents' rights over children as fundamental. So much so that there are no written federal, state, or local laws to protect them. Many judicial decisions against the fundamental rights of parents exist. We are one blood in this oversight. This needs to change. Parental responsibilities we have, but who and how our children are groomed is not protected. My apologies for my assumption of fundamental rights. Ordinances by the city's attorney's own admission hold little weight and often are not enforced. If law enforcement decides to enforce, can they pick and choose culturally relevant protected classes of the day? Who or what is the moral decision maker of how we go about enforcing the ordinance? And I believe we should get rid of the ordinances altogether so that we can all be on the same level. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Is there anyone else here who would like to address council? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
Ann Henriksen, 338 Royal Park Drive, Zealand. Something seems to be missing when we consider the LGBT ordinance proposal. I asked Attorney Vanderveen last week if he was aware of pending lawsuits that the East Lansing had with a Catholic vendor at their city market. He said he didn't know anything about it. During the December Meet the City Council, I happened to mention the same to Mayor Box. He too was not familiar with it. Being they both are attorneys, I thought it pertinent to Holland's proposed ordinance. I will send this entanglement to all city council members, and hope they see it as a warning. This lawsuit cost the taxpayers $182,000. This is the liability of an LGBT plus activism behind the ordinances. It is not just about an ordinance or discrimination. It is an ideology that wants to encroach upon religious freedoms. Not sure you are aware of the money supplied to the LGBT activism drive. Large companies support the movement just to name a few. Stryker, 501c3 in Kalamazoo, Herman Miller here in Zeeland, Whirlpool, Ford, Detroit Edison, Planned Parenthood, 501c3, etc. Once an ordinance is enacted, the supply to the complaint will take any small business down. It is not innocent, but intimidation. Some of the council members have seen a touch of this intimidation display right after the election from the gentleman from Byron Burgeon. At the end of your Holland ordinance is the word liberally enforced. You need to look at it and wonder why that word stands out. What does it mean? I wonder if Councilman Garcia is comfortable with this word when he believes we should have an ordinance so we can enforce the law liberally. Interesting, the language in the ordinance for religious protection is presented next. When Councilman Hoekstra asked last week about religious freedoms for churches and ministries, the mayor spoke briefly that it is covered. What is specific language that describes how churches, ministries, and individuals are protected? Question I have, who will protect the people who stand for their religious values and expressions? The city, or do they have to provide their own defense attorney? I doubt that State Attorney General Nessel will. This is the battle. Holland City Council, are you even considering that your ordinance of protection may destroy the religious freedoms in your city? Here's an example of what could happen. The city of East Lansing is being sued by a farmer who claims his religious views are being discriminated against. Organic apple grower Steve Tennis has been a fixture at the East Lansing Farmers Market for the last 6 years, but his Country Mill Farms won't be there next year. Tennis says since he posted on Facebook last year that his Charlotte farm would not host same-sex weddings because of his family's Catholic beliefs, East Lansing officials have tried to push him out of the farmers market. The city introduced a change to the city farmers market vendor agreement this year requiring vendors to agree to and comply with East Lansing Human Relations Ordinance. Among other things, the ordinance bars discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. But Tennis says he is the one being discriminated against. True tolerance is a two-way street, Tennis told reporters. The government should not eradicate people of faith from the marketplace. The lawsuit filed today in federal court in Western District of Michigan is seeking damages and reversal of the city policy requiring farmer markets vendors agree to East Lansing human relation ordinances. The government should never force its citizens to choose between their deepest convictions and earning a living, says attorney Kate Anderson, the Alliance Defending Freedom. And then it goes on. There's another case in Jackson over ordinance. This is an entanglement I think you need to take a good hard look at. It's not about discrimination, it's about activism, and they'll swoop right in here with your ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Is there anyone else who would like to address council at this time? And would you please state your name and address for the record?
Bob Ashby, 967 Songbird Lane. First, as an aside, with all due respect to the attorneys present and to the city manager, this is what this movement really does. The cakes guy you were referring to, he's been to the Supreme Court twice and won twice, and guess what? He's being taken to court again. They don't care. He's being destroyed by this kind of thing. Over the last 25 years of teaching the Bible, I've always taught that Christ followers are responsible for the reputation of God's Word and God Himself. Tonight I'm going to spend some time trying to share an understanding of why this issue matters to our souls and our consciences and to God himself. It matters for the burden of moral, not just political leadership. The Apostle Paul found an altar in Athens with the inscription to an unknown God. He proclaimed, "The God who made the world and all the things in it is Lord of heaven and earth, and since he himself gives life to all people and breath to all things, in him we live and move and have our being." We have not wandered far from the men of Athens. Our culture in Holland has begun worshiping many things, but they have relegated the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords to the status of an unknown God. God's expectations are not religious. They are personal and alive. That is what the Apostle Paul was talking about in Romans with his treatment of the law, the Mosaic law, not the civil law. The Mosaic law was good. It convicted an entire human race of sin, but it also convicted all sin, including the ones our culture has decided to accept as healthy and even celebrate. It has often been asserted that God is a God of love and that he loves everyone. The assumption is that divine love must involve some form of license, that a person's personal orientation and sexual activities are covered and accepted under this umbrella of unconditional love. But God is a whole God, so to speak. What he reveals of himself, in one respect, is equally true in another aspect. God does not have greater or lesser parts in his character, and therefore the revelation that he gives us in the scriptures, he does not have more love and less justice, more grace and less judgment, more mercy and less holiness. Jesus said that to love God was to obey him, and elsewhere the Apostle John wrote that whoever claims to love God but does not obey him is, in the apostle's words, not mine, lost in spite of what he says. And for our purposes, to the degree that he grants authority, he also demands accountability. Someone has written that there are only 7 biblical references to same-sex behavior, that those passages must be understood in terms of moral wisdom in addition to Scripture. But for God, the situation is much deeper than 7 passages of Scripture. The operation of humanity and the humanity of humanity's moral wisdom. Every pronouncement by God and every action by him is rooted in his own character and is reflected in the original human design and the structures placed for man in creation. That includes sexuality. The gospel is not a matter of interpretation or a weapon for social justice. It is a message of lostness and redemption and rebirth. It calls us to present our bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God. What excites or grieves the heart of God? Scriptures empowered by the Holy Spirit provide the connection to the Father's heart. That is where we get our standards as born-again believers of holiness and marching orders for interacting with the culture. Religion is an organized set of beliefs, of worship and so forth, but Jesus followers, or how Jesus followers live their rebirthed and soulish relationship with God involves a free exercise.
Mr. Mayor, that's 5 minutes.
Thank you, Bob. Your time has expired. Is there anyone else who would like to address council on this issue?
Would it be possible for me to use the remainder of my time?
No, just the one opportunity.
All right.
Anyone else who would like to speak at this time? Seeing none, I will close the public comment portion. We do have a motion on the floor with support. Is there any discussion by council? Yes, Mr. Corbin.
So this is just for the first reading, to move it to first reading?
This vote would be to move it to a vote for first reading. So we're not even, so this vote wouldn't even put it on first reading. This vote would be to move it forward to then item number 16 on the agenda, which then we would need to vote to put it on first reading.
Okay, so the context of the language, is this an opportunity to speak on that? Or
I think you can speak on any subject related to the ordinance that you wanted to at this point, but what we're doing is for the audience's understanding as well, this vote would then merely put it into the process to move it to a point where we would have to vote on first reading, and I know that sounds incredibly redundant, and I'm not sure I understand exactly why myself either, but that's the way the process works. And so you are free to comment on anything that you would like to in regard to the motion that's on the floor.
So to the attorney, Supreme Court ruling Clarna versus State Board of Education back in 1993, where the interpretive law portion is assigned to agencies who have the authority to enforce. Would that apply to would that be applicable to our Human Relations Department and or Human Relations Committee? Because we're requiring them for this language and or make recommendations.
The Human Relations Department would forward a complaint to the Civil Rights Department or the Fair Housing Center. Those bodies would investigate the complaint and determine whether there's a violation or not. It really wouldn't be for our Human Relations Department to make interpretations.
But as a city, we potentially will have an ordinance with a penalty assigned to it. And somebody's likely to interpret it at a local level. Would that be our Human Relations Department or our Human Relations Committee, just like the Civil Rights Committee or Commission at the state level? Just want to make sure.
They're not going to interpret it like the Civil Rights Department and to the same standard. The Civil Rights Department is going to look at a complaint and determine whether there's a violation. The Human Relations Department of the city is not going to evaluate that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments by council? Yes, Mr. Hoekstra.
Just a couple of comments. I'm told that I'm a fairly calm and patient person. I guess that's right. Listening to the discussion on the last item, I found myself, I think the term is starting to vibrate a little bit. I'm 67 years old, and with some age, the passage of time and age, at least I'm finding that my capacity to to endure a lot of discussion, whether I would agree with it or not, I can listen. It's no big deal. I can be calm about it. But at this age, I'm finding it I'm much less able to not vibrate about stuff. I have a decreasing capacity to tolerate things that I think are stupid or irrelevant. And of course, at 67 years of age, my capacity to discern what's stupid and inconsequential is extraordinarily keen. So anyway, I say that to set up some comments about a couple of things I heard. Nearly a decade ago, there was a comment made, and it wasn't you, Brother Mike, it was another one of our colleagues, and in relation to this issue, speaking about the changing of hearts rather than creating a law, and the fact as this person stated, that real change comes from the change of hearts and people, generally speaking. And I can't really disagree with that. And that's the hope, I think, behind any endeavor that we have to create a law or some sort of gauge by which we hope people's behavior will change. But I think all you have to do is look at any section of history, recent or past, very past, to know that that's not the truth. We make laws to create equity. We don't make laws to change hearts, because it doesn't happen that way. When the Civil Rights Act was created, I think it's fair to say that there was not suddenly a purge of discriminatory behaviors or attitudes from the population. Same thing with women's rights. There are people who still believe that women shouldn't vote or hold office or do all kinds of stuff. Workers' rights, you know, when workers were guaranteed certain rights in the workplace, that didn't suddenly and magically eliminate attitudes from a number of people to this day that, well, maybe workers aren't entitled to as much rights as we think. Point being that there's a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a Reformed theologian, once said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination toward injustice makes democracy necessary. There is some sort of insidious amoeba-like thing that infiltrates our minds and our souls. It's called discrimination. For some reason, we like to diminish other people in order to bring ourselves up. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's original sin. For whatever reason, that's part of our existence and our reality. And the goal, the journey that we're on, is to try to eliminate that or minimize it as much as possible. And that's why, to my second point that I want to make, is why it's necessary to do this now rather than wait. The point was made when we were talking about policy versus what we're talking about now, ordinance. If my kid falls down and is injured, I could put a Band-Aid on it. That would fix it now. But maybe a better solution is to take my kid to a doctor for a better analysis of what the problem is, and probably realize an even better remedy for the problem. Why would I go with a half-baked measure when I can see quite clearly that there's a better one out there? Why would I settle for something less when I know the right thing to do is it takes a little bit more effort, but it's there, and I can do it now? I think the point was made last week. The mayor made the point. Why wouldn't we do something if we have the opportunity? To my last point is that what we're talking about and considering today encompasses a certain group of people. It's an important group of people. It's an important issue. It's an opportunity we have right now to make a change for the better of our community. But it's part of a larger exercise that we all know that we're in right now. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We talk about women's rights. Talk about how indigenous people have been treated. We know that there's just a rash of injustice that permeates our society and our psyches and the way that we live life that I think we are acknowledging is not right, it is wrong, and we want to get rid of it. But it's a long process. If you look at the struggle for civil rights over decades, it hasn't all been accomplished in one fell swoop. It's been a series of steps, and one step builds upon another, and that's why an action that we take tonight certainly affects a particular group of people, but it also speaks to the larger struggle to eradicate and minimize and get rid of discrimination in general. It's important for us to realize that this discussion should take place in that larger context, that what we're doing is actually much greater than we may realize. So I'm a little less pissed off right now than I was 10 minutes ago. I love all you guys. I hope you know that. But I'm beyond the point of being willing to be patient about this. It's in our grasp. We have the ability to do something that's right for this community, that the community wants, and I think is demanding. And I think it behooves us to take action. So I'm supporting this ordinance. And I guess with that, I yield the floor, Your Honor.
Thank you, Dave. Other comments from council? Mr. Tathui.
Where Dave is, yup. Brother Hoekstra, I love and respect you, you know that. Always have, always will. My capacity to have some of these discussions is probably shorter than yours is. However, the 9 of us, and whether it's been this makeup of 9 or whatever makeup of 9 over the years we've had, is what makes this group work. We resonate with the residents, sometimes very well, sometimes not so well, but we try to represent all of them. I appreciate everything that was said tonight. I will probably vote in the affirmative tonight, knowing that we have a study session in between here that we're going to have some more discussion to fine tune. I have not made up my mind further than that. What is really, really, really upsetting me right now is the black and white. Because I gave my opinion, I'm in the wrong. Not necessarily with anybody here, not necessarily with anybody there, but you know the feelings that you get? You're getting the feelings. I'm getting the daggers. I'm trying to represent the best I can, at least the 6,000 people in my ward, and the 30,000 people and 100,000 people around here. This is a monumental change. We want to do it right. I was a little taken back that the policy did not pass. We had the opportunity to do something right now. We had the opportunity that the city attorney said that there was nothing wrong with both of them going side by side. As much as people were hurt 11 years ago that didn't pass, I'm a little hurt that didn't pass right now because we had the opportunity. And it wasn't symbolic. I'm sick of hearing that. I'm just as passionate about this as anybody else around this dais. I happen to have a different perspective. Because part of our constituents have a different perspective, and we need to weigh that in. Whether we like it, whether you agree with it or not, it has to be heard. And typically, I'm the devil's advocate that will bring it out. I want to make sure that through our discussions that I'm convinced, and I want to make sure that you're convinced that we're doing the right thing. We disagree. It's always been that way. A lot of times we're 100% in lock. Big issues like this, yeah, there's going to be differences of opinion because it is going to change things substantially for a very, very long time. And we can't say it enough, Mayor. We got to do it right the first time. So I will, as I said, I will vote in the affirmative tonight, knowing that we're going to have the opportunity to have a discussion next week. My gut is going to tell me that we're going to fast track this to have it on the first, very bad choice of words. We are more than likely going to revisit this the first meeting in August, if I'm reading the tea leaves. So we have next week at a study session to have a little bit more conversation about the fine tuning, if in fact there is to be any. We have a week off to think about it, to gather some more information, and then more than likely the first meeting in August. And then 21 days after that, depending on the outcome of what happens on August, more than likely this ordinance will pass, or will be enforced. Thank you for indulging me. I'm done.
Thank you, Mike. Other comments, questions? Mike, I haven't known you as long as, I haven't served with you as long as some folks here, but I think we've known each other for going on 20 years. Always had the highest level of respect. That's only grown since we've had the opportunity to serve together. And if I didn't say it, I want to make sure I say it again. I feel badly that you're in the hot seat on this, because you have come a long way, and we have worked very hard to make sure that we're doing this the right way. And there is a reason why there are 9 chairs here. There's a reason why there are 9 people representing this community, because there are differing views in this community and differing viewpoints, and they are all important. And it is our obligation to make sure that we are representing all of those viewpoints and getting that information out there. So thank you. Thank you for taking that position. Thank you for wanting to do this right. And thank you for wanting to do this correctly, the right way. And I would be frustrated if we always voted 9-0 on everything that was here, because that would mean we weren't tackling any difficult issues. Because it is our job to tackle those difficult issues. It really is. The last thing I want to say is that under the words of this proposed ordinance are, it is the intent of the city that no individual be denied equal protection of the laws, nor shall an individual be denied the enjoyment of their civil rights or be discriminated against because of age, race, national origin, color, disability, education, familial status, sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, height, marital status, religion, source of income, or weight. That's what we will be discussing and voting upon. Kathy, would you please call the roll?
Garcia,
Yes.
Trethewey,
Yes.
Arnstorst,
Yes.
Corbin,
Yes.
Hoekstra,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
Byrd,
Yes.
Peters,
Yes.
Mayor Box.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Next item, I believe, is item 12E 6.1, gifts. Kathy, could you please read the gifts for us?
The city manager's office is pleased to report the following gifts: Parks and Recreation, Sal Perez Scholarship, donations collected from the 2020 softball tournament fundraiser event held on June 26th, $445.12. Revenues, 5 teams, team fees, $1,100. Expenses, ad, American Marketing Group, T-shirts, $224.88. Umpiring fees, $430. In-kind donations, umpire wage, Arnie Rangel, 5 games at $22 each, $110. Parks and Recreation, Lakeview Playground, Hovman Electric, $100. It is recommended that these donations be accepted with appreciation, credited to the appropriate account, and an expression of gratitude be forwarded to said donors.
Motion to accept with appreciation.
Moved by Trethewey. Is there support? Support by Byrd. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. Next item, item number 13, communications from the city manager. Mr. Van Beek.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Council, I will choose not to say much tonight, but as I've joked with some people, which probably isn't much of a joke either on the topic or the Parks Director Andy Kenyon came in my office on Monday, July 6, and said, "We have an infestation." And I said, "You must be joking." Like we needed one more thing in 2020. And unfortunately, he was not. As I communicated with all of you and communicated that I give you this update tonight, many of the trees in Pilgrim Home Cemetery staff had noticed were starting to show some thinning and other ill health. And upon investigation, staff, because we have a talented staff that know a lot about trees, of course they cut a lot of them down, but they still know a lot about trees, they were afraid that it was a gypsy moth infestation. And we called in Bartlett, local tree experts, and within a couple days they confirmed that yes, in fact, we did. There were 350 trees approximately that were impacted in Pilgrim Home Cemetery. And surprisingly, some of our staff, and certainly I was not aware, that included a stand of close to, I don't know if I'm seeing the number, but close to 100 pine trees that I thought, I've never seen much of anything eat pine trees. But they were defoliating the pine trees also, and some of those pine trees are 80 to 100 feet tall, and we're pretty sure that they're at least 100 years old. We have a process in place, a purchasing ordinance that allows emergency bids and actions to take place. I felt that this definitely constituted an emergency. Because if we did not take action and the gypsy moth, particularly the caterpillars, continued to eat the trees, while some of the other type of beech trees have a tendency of being able to bounce back from some of these things, those pine trees in particular, we were very worried about, and unfortunately we do believe that we are going to lose some of those pine trees. So what happened is Bartlett made a plan. So in under a week from when we first diagnosed the problem, they went out and they sprayed those trees on Sunday evening. Here you can see them doing that. They suggested and we agreed that they do that in the evening for lots of different reasons, less traffic, usually it's calmer winds. And they went through the entire cemetery with a crew of people from several states. They actually called in so they could do this because it was such a big job. And they have specialized equipment that you can see there. And ultimately, you can hardly see this in the back, but what looks like someone showing a flashlight up in the air, that's actually a high-pressured hose that's spraying up into the foliage of the tree. We believe they did complete that by Monday morning. We believe that and feel that it was successful, and it was exemplified by happy birds on Monday and Tuesday that had lots of extra caterpillars to eat around the perimeter of all of those trees.
I believe that the term that Andy Kenyon used on Monday, it was raining caterpillars.
It was raining caterpillars. And unfortunately, the week before, it's been a long night. It was raining other things before the caterpillars came down, needless to say. It was an eerie sight out there. So there was a total cost of $21,456 that we incurred with that. The ordinance does not require you to take additional action on that, but for me to inform you, we certainly are comfortable that in the upcoming budget adjustments, we paid for that out of park funds. And if we feel necessary, we'll make adjustments. We think probably eventually we'll pay for that out of contingency within the 2021 budget. We do believe that there is a good chance that the deciduous trees will probably leaf back up yet even this year. In fact, our assistant city manager, Matt Van Dyken, at a cottage that he's part owner in, other side of the state, actually went through this, and he was happy to see, you all know that he's very happy, that he likes to play with remote cameras. So he keeps a close eye on his property, and was surprised to see that trees that were bare within a week after that started to spring leaves back. So we're hopeful about that. But we do expect that this very likely is another treatment that we're going to have to monitor and make again next year. And hopefully we've caught it where we limited the loss of pine trees in the cemetery. Certainly we'll continue to monitor that, answer any questions that you might have. If you have an in-depth question, I might have to get that from Andy Kenyon and bring that to you back on another date. But I definitely wanted to make you aware of this. This was a big deal last week. I'm really glad that our staff caught it early, that we found the right experts to address it, and that we were able to take care of it right away. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Keith? Comments? No? Next is appointments and communications from the mayor. I think that the title on this is incorrect, otherwise I've got some questions. The mayoral term date correction and reappointments to city boards and commissions. I believe that is just a term date correction on one of the appointments that we made in regard to the compensation.
We're not changing your term, correct?
Right, thank you. I wanted to make
Yes,
sure
yes.
that there was not a change to my term. Oh, all right then. Let me call my wife.
That study session?
Yeah. So it's to correct Paul Catterberg's incorrect term expiration date of June 30, 2024 on the Compensation Committee to the correct date of June 30, 2020, as the terms of this committee must be staggered. And then the reappointments of Paul Catterberg to the Compensation Commission for his second full term, said term expiring June 30, 2022, and Dwayne Baker to the Teen Court Advisory Board for his fourth term, that term expiring July 14, 2022, and it's the recommendation that the council accept these appointments and corrections, not to the mayor's term, but to the others.
Oh, okay. Son of a gun. So moved, as stated by the mayor.
Moved by Councilman Trethewey, support by Aaron Source. Any discussion? And Kathy, could you please call the roll?
Trethewey,
Yes.
Ernst Horst,
Yes.
Corbin, Hoekstra,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
Byrd,
Yes.
Peters, Garcia,
Yes.
Mayor Box.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Next item, appointments, motions, and communications from council members. Anything from council members this evening?
Your Honor.
Yes, Mr. Hoekstra.
Relative to our discussion on the non-discrimination ordinance, this probably, well, it does fall within the purview of the Human Relations Commission and the Human Relations Department more so than any other commission that we have. And I mentioned this earlier, I think, in our discussions, but without asking for a formal motion or anything, I would think somewhat out of courtesy, but also out of respect for the HRC's overview, I would like to ask for the Human Relations Director to bring the language to the HRC for their consideration and the opportunity to make any comments if they were to choose to do so, not under any obligation, but we'll just make that request.
Yeah, that's unscheduled to do so per our conversation last week. They just haven't had a meeting since then,
I
so.
believe it's tomorrow.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Any other comments from council members, communications?
Just
Yes,
one,
Nikki.
just a shout out to Andy Kenyon and the Parks and Recreation Department for the awesome job at the Lakeview Park and about 6 blocks away from me. And they've been working for so long and it looks great. You see parents and their little kids come to visit. Is it done yet? Is it done yet? And it's a good job. It's a nice example of a, private and the public contribution. So good for them.
Great.
Good for us.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, next item is item number 16, first reading of ordinances. 16A, adding a new chapter consisting of sections 25.1 through 25.9 of Chapter 15, Protection Against Discrimination. Mr. Van Beek? Is there a motion from council?
So moved.
Moved by Hoekstra, support by Peters. Any discussion? Seeing none, Kathy, would you please call the roll?
Arnshorst,
Yes.
Corbin, Hoekstra,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
Byrd,
Yes.
Peters, Garcia,
Yes.
Trethewey, Mayor Box.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. I will entertain one final motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Moved by Trethewey, support by Peters. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you.